This is the Fallacies podcast for English 122. Fallacies are gaps in the logic of an argument. They are places where the logos, or logic and reason, would not hold up to scrutiny. As strong academic writers, we want to learn about fallacies to avoid using them in our own writing, thus avoiding places where our arguments could be discredited. As strong critical readers, we want to learn about fallacies to be able to point them out in our sources. For A4, this could be useful for challenging a counter-perspective, or avoiding sources that have deficiencies in logos, and thus are unreliable. Fagley and Seltzer provide a list of several logical fallacies on pages 17 through 19. Although this is a long list, it is by no means comprehensive, as there are over 100 types and subtypes of fallacies. If you have not taken a look at the list in your book, it is worth doing so, since many of these fallacies are common in student writing and will help you know what to look for and avoid in your own writing. Fagley and Seltzer divide these fallacies into logical and emotional fallacies, since some fallacies play on emotion to distract from gaps in logic. However, they are almost always based in logical gaps. Because there are many types of fallacies, I am generally less concerned with your ability to identify these fallacies by name. I usually will be more concerned with your ability to find gaps in logic than with your ability to name that gap. However, this podcast is devoted to 4 fallacies that I do want you to be able to identify. They are common in student writing, and it is important for you to know what they are and how they work so you can avoid them as you construct your argument. The first fallacy I want you to know is called an ad hominem fallacy. Ad hominem is a Latin term that translated to English means against the man or against the person. In this type of fallacy, a logical gap is created when a claim or argument is rejected on the basis of some irrelevant fact about the author or the person presenting the claim or argument. Although not quite the same, this is similar to the name-calling fallacy described in your book. Both rely on attacking the character of the author rather than the actual argument. An ad hominem fallacy is a 2-step fallacy. In the first step, an attack is made against the character of the author, her circumstances, or her actions. That attack is then taken to be evidence against the argument itself. The fallacy takes the following form. First, Susie makes a claim. Joe then attacks Susie's character. Joe then says because of his attack on Susie's character, Susie's claim is false. So let's look at a specific example. First, Susie claims that fast food isn't good for your health. Joe disagrees, so he responds by saying that Susie is an ugly and bitter person. Therefore, Joe thinks you shouldn't listen to Susie. Here's why this kind of strategy is flawed logic. An ad hominem attack of any kind is a fallacy because the character, circumstances, or actions of a person do not, in most cases, have a bearing on the truth or falsity of the claim being made, or the quality of the argument being made. In our example, this is a fallacy because even if Joe is right about Susie and she is bitter and ugly, it does not affect the claim she has made about fast food. In rare cases, examining the character of the author relates to the quality of the argument. For example, as we saw in examining the reliability of a source, the author's reliability can relate to the quality of the argument. However, it is always better to focus on the argument itself rather than the author to keep an academically appropriate tone. In addition, if you decide to examine the author's character or circumstances as a way to challenge an argument, you would be responsible for proving that the character flaw you identify is directly related to flaws in the argument. This is usually difficult to do in an academically effective way. We see these kinds of fallacies most commonly in American politics, so it's easy to want to use this kind of logical gap since it is regularly modeled for us in American culture. While these tactics are effective on human psychology, it is important to avoid easy logical gaps when creating an academic argument. The second type of fallacy you need to know is the hasty generalization fallacy. It happens when a person draws a conclusion about a population based on a sample that is not large enough to be representative. This is another 2-step fallacy. First, an author takes a sample, which is too small from a larger population. A conclusion is then drawn about the whole population based on the too small sample. For example, let's say that Bobby gets cut off by 2 cars with Ohio license plates in one day. Therefore, Bobby concludes that most drivers from Ohio will cut him off. This is a fallacy because the sample is too small to warrant a broader conclusion. However, a fallacy can be avoided if the sample is large enough to fully represent a broader population. In our example, it would be pretty obvious that two drivers do not represent a broader population of thousands and thousands of Ohio drivers. However, if Bobby did experience get cutting off by thousands of drivers from Ohio, and if he took notes and perhaps pictures to evidence those events, and was able to show that the number of drivers who cut him off was a large representative sample, say 90%, his conclusion that Ohio drivers would cut him off would be valid. However, there is a lot of proof involved in avoiding this fallacy. A hasty generalization lacks that proof. The third type of fallacy you should be able to identify is the post hoc fallacy. The full name for this type of fallacy is post hoc ergo propter hoc. This is usually translated as after this, therefore because of this. This may sound confusing, but it's basically a causal fallacy, and you don't need to remember all of the Latin. Essentially, this fallacy is committed when it is concluded that one event causes another, simply because the proposed cause occurred before the proposed effect. Here's how it works. The fallacy takes the form that the author identifies event A that occurs before event B. Therefore, event A is interpreted as the cause of event B. This can happen as an obvious fallacy or as a sneaky fallacy. In our first example, event A is when Joan sneezes in London. Event B is when an earthquake happens 10 minutes later in California. Therefore, Jill's sneeze must have caused the earthquake. In our second example, Jack installs a new piece of software on his computer, which is event A. Shortly after, his computer crashes, event B. Therefore, the new software must have caused the computer crash. These are both fallacies because they do not sufficiently establish cause and effect. In the first example, this is obviously a fallacy because there is no reason to believe that Jill's sneeze caused the earthquake. In the second example, Jack assumes that the software caused his computer to crash. While it could be true, the fallacy is in his assumption. If Jack were to take his computer into the Geek Squad or a computer-savvy tech friend, and he received a diagnostic report proving that the computer crashed because of the new software, then it would no longer be an assumption, and there would no longer be a fallacy. But for example 2 to no longer be a fallacy, Jack must prove that there is a connection. This is much like when we learned about correlation versus causation in our discussion of causal arguments. Just because two events are correlated does not mean that they are causally linked. In this type of fallacy, someone makes an assumption that that correlation is a causation. The final fallacy I will expect you to know is the straw man fallacy. This is a fallacy that is easy to commit without meaning to, and it's one that I myself often have to do a round of revision in my own writing, designed specifically to find and eliminate these. The straw man fallacy is committed when a person simply ignores a person's actual position and substitutes a distorted, exaggerated, or misrepresented version of that position. The format for these can be a little complicated. First, a person makes an argument. This is the original argument, argument X. Then a second person who disagrees with that first argument describes the argument as argument Y. Argument Y is a distorted version of argument X, and though they are often similar, they are not the same. The second person attacks argument Y as bad, flawed, or wrong. Finally, the second person argues that argument X is therefore bad, flawed, or wrong. Let's look at an example of a straw man fallacy to see how this works. In our example, Senator Johnson says we should not be spending money on a submarine defense program. This is the original argument, argument X. Senator Bright then says, Senator Johnson wants to leave us defenseless against our enemy attacks. This is argument Y. Notice that it is slightly related to argument X, but it is definitely not the same. Senator Bright says, leaving the U.S. defenseless against enemy attacks is a bad idea. In this statement, Bright is showing that argument Y is wrong. Senator Bright then says, Senator Johnson's idea is a bad idea because it leaves us defenseless. In this statement, Bright indicates that Johnson's argument, argument X, is bad because argument Y is bad. Here's why this is faulty logic. Attacking a distorted version of a position simply does not constitute an attack on the position itself. Setting up a distorted argument and then attacking that distorted version ignores the original argument entirely. In our example, it may very well be a bad thing to leave the U.S. completely defenseless. However, Senator Bright's complaint has almost nothing to do with Senator Johnson's first claim. Therefore, it does nothing to disprove Johnson's actual claim. Strawman fallacies are intentionally made when it is difficult to disprove or challenge the original argument, so the challenger then sets up an argument that is much easier to disprove, like we saw in our example. However, these fallacies are usually made in student writing unintentionally. In most cases, the strawman argument is based on an honest misinterpretation of the original argument. While it is usually a mistake made in good faith, it is still a logical fallacy, so make sure that when addressing a counterposition you have fairly and accurately interpreted the arguments of the sources you seek to disprove. In review, we learned about four main types of fallacies today. The first is an ad hominem fallacy, in which an argument against an author is substituted for disproving an argument. The second is a hasty generalization fallacy, in which a broad conclusion is drawn from a too small sample of a bigger population. The third is the post hoc fallacy, in which event A is interpreted as the cause of event B, simply because event A occurs first. Finally, we learned about the strawman fallacy, which occurs when an author challenges an argument based on disproving a distorted and incorrect version of that argument. Remember that these are only four of many fallacies. Please also look over the list of logical fallacies in your book on pages 17 through 19. The more logical fallacies that you are aware of, the easier it is to construct an argument that uses logos effectively.